Welcome to Chapter 10, Conflict and Negotiation. It's funny when I look at this photo, it appears there's a lot more conflict than negotiation going on there, but whatever. Okay, what do you need to learn from Chapter 10? The nature of conflict in organizations, the sources of conflict, where they come from, the various approaches to conflict, conflict management techniques, the process of negotiation, and third party interventions. Let's jump in. So, there's two types of conflict: functional conflict and dysfunctional conflict. Functional conflict happens when, listen, there's incompatible goals or attitudes or emotions, and there's some sort of disagreement between two or more people. Functional conflict actually improves the performance. It's constructive disagreement. It's a healthy way to express options, to stimulate creativity, and it is necessary if organizations are going to continue to evolve and improve. Dysfunctional conflict, on the other hand, it hinders performance. It is an unhealthy or destructive disagreement. It's when two parties don't see eye to eye and they express their opposing views in ways that is detrimental to the relationships and the organization as a whole. So there are some positive consequences and there are negative consequences to conflict, right? As we've seen here, dysfunctional conflict has negative consequences. Functional conflict has positive consequences. So what are the positive consequences of disagreement? Leads to new ideas, stimulates creativity, it motivates change, promotes organizational vitality, helps individuals and groups establish identities, and serves as a safety valve to indicate when there are problems within an organization. On the other hand, negative consequences of conflict is that it can divert from work, it can threaten people psychologically, it obviously can waste a lot of time and energy, create a negative conflict, break down cohesion within an organization, and increase hostility and aggressive behaviors. You don't want any of that in an organization because it damages the relationships. Okay, what are the phases of conflict? So there are four distinct phases for every major conflict. The first one is the prelude stage or latent conflict, and that is where conflict hasn't arisen yet. It is under the surface, it's kind of bubbling up, but it is not quite there yet. The next thing is the perceived conflict. There's often a trigger event when conflict becomes apparent, and then it's got to be dealt with, right? Manifest is the conflict stage where opposing views are expressed, and at some times they may become entrenched, meaning that you may dig in your heels, you say, this is what I believe, it doesn't matter what you do. I'm not changing my mind. And then hopefully you get to the aftermath stage, and that is when there is a resolution, the dispute is settled, and a new equilibrium is established within an organization. So we talked about this a little bit last week in the storming type of stage in group development, and this is where a lot of conflict arises. And it's not always a bad thing, that's for sure. There are three sources of conflict. There's task conflict, process conflict, and relationship conflict. So what is task conflict? Task conflict often involves when people disagree about what or why something should happen. And task conflict is typically functional, right? It has to do with the function of an organization, and it can positively impact that group. Process conflict, on the other hand, is differing opinions about how or who is going to accomplish a task or a procedure within an organization. Both of those are collectively referred to as cognitive conflict because they're cognitive in nature, right? if you think about it, it has to do with like cerebral processing. Effective conflict is relationship conflict, and that is when there's interpersonal difficulties. And you've all worked with people in which you may not see eye to eye with. Their personality, for some reason, rubs you the wrong way. And this often, results in dysfunctional relationships within an organization. So it's not always a great thing to have within an organization. The interesting part is all of this can sometimes be thrown into one where you have a task, process, and relationship conflict kind of wrapped up in one situation. So these are not always distinct steps or sources. Sometimes it can be a little bit of A, B, and C. Okay, so how do we approach conflict? This is really important. There is the zero-sum approach, and that is when you are trying to gain a certain, a certain perspective or maybe a certain asset within an organization, and you have to win, and the other group has to lose. So you're really focusing on maximizing the outcome for yourself or your team, and you're focusing more on assertiveness and maybe being right, gaining power or control. And then there's the other side, and that is a win-win approach. And in this focus is entirely different because you're focusing on a situation where you both compromise maybe a little bit, but the goal is to cooperate, and the goal is to satisfy the needs of both sides by maybe giving a little bit of what you would not if you were in a zero-sum situation where you're like, I'm not giving up an inch and it's my way or the highway type perspective. Okay. Conflict management styles, how people manage conflict within an organization can range, can have a big range. So the degree of assertiveness and cooperativeness impacts people's ability to deal with conflict. How confrontational are you going to be? How assertive and how cooperative are you going to be? So the first way is to just avoid it or withdraw. And that's a low level of assertiveness. You're trying to really cooperate and just say, listen, I would rather avoid it completely than be in a situation where I have to be assertive or deal with a little bit of conflict. Accommodating is also a low level of assertiveness, and you're really trying to cooperate there, and you're kind of just yielding to the other side's position. On the other hand, we have assertiveness, right? When you are competing, you're fighting for your side and you're not really worried about cooperating. You're worried about being right and to win, right? You want to maximize your benefit. And then we have the collaborating side, and collaborating is you are trying to solve the problem together. You're trying to find a resolution that is mutually beneficial. And in the middle, the circle, the golden circle, is when you're compromising. So it's a little bit of assertiveness, a little bit of cooperation. You're trying to advocate for your position, but you're also looking for the win-win. You're trying to make sure that you treat the other person with respect and dignity, and you want to maintain that relationship. So you don't want to be too far in the corners, competing or accommodating, avoiding or collaborating. You want to be in the middle where you're really negotiating openly and you're trying to find a situation where everyone wins. Okay, conflict management techniques. There's a lot of ways that you deal with conflict. There's entire courses that have you dealing with conflict, and here are just a few. So, effective ways to deal with conflict: appealing to subordinate goals, expanding resources, changing personnel structure, improving communication, negotiating. All those are effective ways to deal with conflict. On the other hand, avoiding being hostile, character assassination, going after the person, retaliating, building a coalition or a group of people that may, believe one thing and you're attacking the other side. So these are ways that is not very effective in dealing with conflict. Negotiation in conflict management. So there's an integrative negotiation and there's disruptive negotiation. The integrative, as we talked about it previously, you want to separate the person from the problem. You want to focus on creating a win-win situation collaboratively, and you are really presenting them maybe with a couple of options in the best effort to achieve mutual agreement. On the other side, disruptive has the two horns that are kind of butting each other, and this is where you are doing the win-loss. You're acting like an adversary to the other person. You're trying to win, and you're trying to get as much value or maximize your outcome as much as possible, right? Okay, here's a great way to approach a negotiation. Before negotiating, decide what the best alternative to a negotiated agreement is for you. Be aware of what you really want and try to give the other side a little bit of what they want as well. And the strongest negotiating position will be less inclined to win and more about finding the best alternative so both parties are in a good situation. And that is simply called the beta or BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And that's a good perspective. When you go in, before you go in there, really try to figure out what is the best situation for yourself and what are you willing to compromise on. Which brings us to this zone of potential agreement, or ZOPA. And what that is, and I think this is such an interesting diagram, it talks about how there is a zone there. You can see the ZOPA zone in which two parties have that area of overlap where you might be giving up a little bit, they might be giving up a little bit, and the larger that negotiating range is, where those dotted lines are, the better chance you have of making a deal. If there's zero space, right, it says on the top there's the buyer, there's the seller, there's a little bit of overlap. If you think maybe selling a house, if you want to sell a house for $500,000 and you list the house at $550,000, and then people kind of negotiate back and forth, and they really wanted $525,000. So maybe there's a zone there between $500,000 and $525,000 where you can agree. But if you want to sell a house, you want to sell it for $500,000, and they want to buy a house for $450,000. There's a $50,000 difference. That's called a negative bargaining zone, meaning there's no overlap and very little chance of you coming to an agreement. So when all else fails and you can't come to an agreement mutually together internally, you go to third-party conflict interventions. And so we have a number listed in this chart. We have mediators, and mediators help negotiate an agreement, which means they try to bring both parties together to accept an agreement. An arbitrator, on the other hand, is someone who's trusted to come to a conclusion and make a judgment, which means that the participants don't have a choice but to accept them, right? So a mediator tries to bring people together and people can walk away and say no, where an arbitrator comes in and says, I'll be the judge of this, I'll come to the solution, and you guys have to agree. Mediation, arbitration, and then the last one, if both of those fail, if you go through mediation, it doesn't work, you go through arbitration, it doesn't work, you have no other choice but then to go to litigation, and litigation is when you bring it in front of a court, and the court has a ruling after a trial, and then a decision is made there with no obviously input from the participants. So that is a very quick overview, not a lot in this chapter, of conflict resolution. Just the one model there, not a lot of new terminology. If you have any questions about any of that information, please, as always, don't hesitate to reach out and ask.